The Sterling Room. The Sterling Room wasn't just a restaurant, it was Manhattan's temple of power. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables where million-dollar deals were sealed with handshakes. White orchids adorned each table, their delicate beauty a stark contrast to the cutthroat conversations happening beneath them. Margaret Walker pushed through the heavy glass doors, immediately drawing curious stares. Her simple black dress, wrinkled from a grueling 20-hour flight from Singapore, hung loosely on her tired frame. Her usually pristine chestnut hair had escaped its ponytail during the flight, framing her exhausted face in unruly wisps. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, the price of back-to-back international meetings and jumping time zones. She hadn't even stopped at her hotel, coming straight from JFK with just her small carry-on. Punctuality had always mattered more to Margaret than appearances, though the Sterling Room rarely witnessed such priorities. "I believe Antonio is expecting me," she said quietly to the host, who studied her with barely concealed skepticism. At the restaurant's center table sat Richard Harrington, a hedge fund manager whose cruelty was legendary in Manhattan's elite circles. His Savile Row suit fit like armor, his Swiss watch catching the light with every calculated gesture. His companions, equally polished and predatory, hung on his every word. Richard was a man who measured his worth by how effectively he could destroy others. He collected moments of humiliation like trophies, the stammering waiter, the overwhelmed tourist, anyone who dared exist in his space without proper credentials. It wasn't about money or fame, it was about the intoxicating rush of power that came from public dominance. His predatory gaze locked onto Margaret as she was led to her table. He registered her wrinkled clothes, obvious fatigue, and simple attire. A slow, familiar smile spread across his face, the same smile that had preceded countless humiliations. "Well, well," he murmured to his companions, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Looks like someone got lost on the way to the diner down the street." His companions snickered on cue, their laughter drawing more attention to Margaret. She noticed, of course. But unlike Richard's usual targets, Margaret didn't shrink. Instead, she met his gaze directly, her exhausted eyes suddenly sharp and assessing. The hunt had begun. But this time, the prey was watching the hunter. "The performance begins." Margaret opened her menu, her fingers still stiff from the airplane's recycled air. The Sterling Room's signature lighting, designed to flatter wealthy complexions, cast a warm glow across her table. She could feel Richard's gaze cataloging each perceived flaw, the faint coffee stain on her sleeve, her travel-worn shoes, the absence of designer accessories that served as the restaurant's unofficial entry fee. A young waiter approached, his practiced smile wavering when he saw her. He had the careful posture of someone who'd learned that perfect service was his only armor in rooms filled with power. "Perhaps Madame would prefer our prix-fixe option," he suggested, pointedly avoiding mention of the chef's tasting menu, the most expensive offering. His eyes darted briefly toward Richard's table, seeking approval for handling this unexpected situation. "The full tasting menu, please," Margaret replied, her voice carrying quiet confidence that momentarily confused the waiter. "And sparkling water for now. I'll decide on wine after speaking with Antonio." The mention of the owner's name caused the slightest flicker of uncertainty in the waiter's eyes, but he nodded professionally and withdrew. Richard's laugh cut through the ambient conversation like a blade. "Better check your credit limit first, honey. That menu costs more than your entire outfit." Several diners turned to watch the unfolding spectacle. This was the Sterling Room's unspoken entertainment, the occasional public takedown that reminded everyone of the social hierarchy's rigid boundaries. A ritual where those inside the circle demonstrated why others should remain outside. Margaret took a slow sip of water, her eyes never leaving Richard's. "I'm sure I'll manage." Her calm response only fueled Richard's determination. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with theatrical disdain, a performer who knew his audience well. "Let me guess," he continued, each question designed to pierce dignity. "Big night out? Once-in-a-lifetime splurge? Tourist bucket list perhaps, eat where the real New Yorkers eat?" Margaret placed her napkin in her lap with deliberate care. Just hungry. The brevity of her response seemed to irritate Richard more than any defense might have. Around them, conversations had quieted, the surrounding tables now passive participants in the unfolding drama. You know, Richard continued, his voice rising to ensure everyone could hear, there's a perfectly decent diner 10 blocks south. Plastic menus, free refills, much more your ambience. He pronounced the last word with exaggerated precision, as if teaching vocabulary to a child. His companions snickered, emboldened by his cruelty. A woman in diamonds at the next table poorly concealed her smirk behind a manicured hand. Thank you for the recommendation, Margaret replied evenly. Perhaps another time. The trap tightens. Richard stood, sensing an opportunity. He casually strolled toward Margaret's table, wine glass in hand, a predator moving in for the kill. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath, even the soft classical music seemed to dim. I'm just trying to save you from embarrassment, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. This place has standards. Doesn't it feel a bit aspirational for someone like you? The Sterling Room had become a theater, with Richard center stage and Margaret unwillingly cast as his foil. A woman at a nearby table discreetly raised her phone, anticipating a moment worth capturing. Someone like me? Margaret echoed, looking directly into his eyes. For the first time, something flickered behind her exhausted gaze, a depth that momentarily gave Richard pause. Not fear, not anger, but something he couldn't quite place. It was gone before he could identify it, but it left him momentarily unsettled. Richard quickly recovered, glancing around to ensure his audience remained engaged. Well, let's be honest, you're clearly not from around here. He gestured vaguely at her appearance, his diamond cufflink catching the light. The Sterling Room has a certain clientele, a certain quality we've come to expect. The dining room had grown quieter. Even the waitstaff paused, watching the scene unfold with practiced neutrality that barely masked their discomfort. A sommelier froze mid-pour, wine hovering above crystal. And you're the arbiter of quality? Margaret asked, her voice still composed but with a new edge that made several observers shift uneasily. The question wasn't defensive, it was almost curious, as if she were studying a specimen. Richard laughed, playing to his audience. I don't need to be. Quality announces itself. He gestured grandly around the room. Look around. Everyone here belongs. Everyone except. He let the implication hang in the air, savoring the moment. This was what he lived for, the public humiliation, the moment when his victim finally broke. But Margaret didn't break. Instead, she reached into her small purse and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, and within seconds, she was placing a call. Antonio, she said, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that made Richard's confident smile falter slightly. Yes, I'm here. At table 12. There seems to be some confusion about whether I belong in your establishment. The phone call lasted only seconds, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Richard's confidence wavered as he noticed the maitre d' approaching their table with quick, purposeful steps. The tables turn. Antonio Ricci himself emerged from the kitchen, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of barely controlled panic. The legendary restaurateur, who had hosted presidents and celebrities, moved through his dining room with uncharacteristic urgency. Ms. Walker, he said, slightly breathless as he reached Margaret's table. My sincerest apologies for any inconvenience. Your usual private dining room wasn't ready, and I thought. It's quite all right, Antonio, Margaret interrupted gently, her exhaustion momentarily lifting. I actually prefer sitting out here tonight. It's been educational. Richard stood frozen, his wine glass suspended halfway to his lips. The color had drained from his face as he began to process what was happening. Antonio's eyes swept the dining room, taking in the awkward silence, the curious stares, and Richard's obvious discomfort. His gaze settled on Richard with the cold assessment of a man who had built his reputation on reading people. "Mr. Harrington," Antonio said, his voice carrying a chill that made several nearby diners wince. "I trust you've been hospitable to one of our most valued guests." Margaret stood gracefully, her simple black dress suddenly seeming less like travel wear and more like the understated elegance of someone who had nothing to prove. She extended her hand to Richard, who stared at it as if it might bite him. "Margaret Walker," she said simply. "CEO of Walker Industries. We own the building you're sitting in, Richard. In fact, we own most of the block." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face cycled through shades of red and white as the implications hit him. Walker Industries, the tech conglomerate that had quietly revolutionized half the world's infrastructure. The company whose CEO was famously private, shunning publicity and social media. "I've just returned from Singapore," Margaret continued conversationally, "where we finalized a partnership that will bring about 1,500 new jobs to Manhattan. I was looking forward to a quiet dinner before the press conference tomorrow morning." She turned to Antonio with a warm smile. "The usual table will be fine next time. Tonight, I think I'll take my meal to go." Richard's companions had already begun distancing themselves, their chairs scraping against the floor as they subtly shifted away from their suddenly toxic friend. The woman with the phone had lowered it, her social media post taking on a very different narrative than she'd originally planned. "Ms. Walker," Richard stammered, finally finding his voice. "I had no idea. I mean, I didn't realize." Margaret's gaze returned to him, and this time he clearly saw what he'd missed before, the quiet confidence of someone who wielded more power before breakfast than he'd see in his lifetime. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it was steel. "Of course you didn't," she said softly. "That was rather the point. The reckoning." The Sterling Room had become a museum of mortification, with Richard as the centerpiece exhibit. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the unfolding disaster, phones discreetly recording what would undoubtedly become Manhattan's most talked-about social media moment by morning. Margaret gathered her small purse, her movements unhurried and deliberate. "You know, Richard, I've sat through boardroom battles with men who could buy and sell you before lunch. I've negotiated with foreign ministers and tech moguls who would consider you a minor irritation at best." Her voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "But never have I encountered someone so proud of their own smallness." Richard's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his legendary wit completely deserting him when he needed it most. His hedge fund managed a respectable $1 billion in assets, but Walker Industries' quarterly revenue exceeded that figure. He was a minnow who had just tried to devour a shark. Antonio appeared beside Margaret with a to-go bag from the kitchen. "Your dinner, Ms. Walker. And again, my deepest apologies for this unpleasantness." "No apologies necessary," Margaret replied, accepting the bag. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected teachers." She glanced meaningfully at Richard. "I imagine Mr. Harrington has learned something important tonight about assumptions." The young waiter who had initially doubted Margaret's ability to pay watched in stunned silence as she discreetly slipped him a $100 bill. "For your trouble," she said quietly. "And remember, in this business, the quietest customers are often the most important ones." As Margaret moved toward the exit, conversations gradually resumed, but the atmosphere remained electric with the aftermath of social carnage. Richard slumped into his chair, suddenly looking decades older than his 45 years. His companions had completely abandoned him now, their earlier sycophantic laughter replaced by the urgent need to distance themselves from his spectacular downfall. Business cards were already being passed between tables as people began calculating how to leverage this moment for their own networking advantage. The woman who had filmed the encounter was furiously typing on her phone, her caption probably reading something like, "Karma served at the Sterling Room, billionaire CEO humiliated by Wall Street bro goes viral." Margaret paused at the door and turned back one final time. The entire restaurant held its breath. "Richard," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "That diner you mentioned? 10 blocks south. She smiled, not cruelly, but with the patience of someone who had just taught a particularly slow student an important lesson. I actually own that too. The staff there would have treated me with more dignity than you showed tonight. The heavy glass doors closed behind her with a soft whisper, leaving Richard alone with the wreckage of his reputation and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who don't need to prove it. As Margaret stepped onto the Manhattan sidewalk, she pulled out her phone and smiled at the dozens of missed messages from her assistant, the press, and board members excited about tomorrow's announcement. She had come to New York to discuss expanding her empire, but instead, she had reminded herself why she preferred to let her work speak for itself. In the Sterling room behind her, Richard sat in the ruins of his social standing, finally understanding that true power didn't need to announce itself, it simply was. The end.